Scarcely had the Great Eastern tacked and presented her stern to the waves, than the pitching gave way to perfect steadiness. Breakfast was served, and the greater part of the passengers, reassured by the ship's stillness, came into the dining rooms, and took their repast without fear of another shock. Not a plate fell off the table, and not a glass emptied its contents on to the cloth, although the racks had not even been put up. But 3/4 of an hour later the furniture was set in motion again, and the crockery clattered together on the pantry shelves, for the Great Eastern had resumed her westerly course, which for the time had been interrupted. I went on deck again with Dr. Pitford, who, seeing the man belonging to the dolls, said to him, "Your little people have been put to a severe test, sir. Those poor babies will never prattle in the United States." 125p Shaw, replied the enterprising Parisian, "the stock was insured and my secret has not perished with it." It was evident my countryman was not a man to be easily disheartened. He bowed to us with a pleasant smile, and we continued our way to the stern, where a steersman told us that the rudder chains had been jammed in the interval between the two swoops. "If that accident had happened when we were turning," said Pitford to me, "I cannot say what would have become of us, for the sea would have rushed in overwhelming torrents. The steam pumps have already begun to reduce the water, but there is more coming yet." "And what of the unfortunate sailor?" asked I of the doctor. "He is severely wounded on his head, poor fellow. He is a young married fisherman, the father of 2 children, and this is his first voyage. The doctor seems to think there is hope of his recovery, and that is what makes me fear for him, but we shall soon see for ourselves." A report was spread that several men had been washed overboard, but happily there was no foundation for it. "We have resumed our course at last," said I. "Yes," replied the doctor, "the westerly course against wind and tide, there is no doubt about that," added he, catching hold of a kevel to prevent himself from rolling on 126 the deck. "Do you know what I should do with the Great Eastern if she belonged to me?" "No." "Well, I would make a pleasure boat of her and charge 10,000 francs a head. There would only be millionaires on board and people who were not pressed for time. I would take a month or 6 weeks going from England to America, the ship never against the waves and the wind always ahead or astern. There should be no rolling, no pitching, and I would pay a 100f. in any case of seasickness." "That is a practical idea," said I. "Yes," replied Pitford, "there's money to be gained or lost by that." In the meantime the Great Eastern was slowly but steadily continuing her way. The swell was frightful, but her straight stem cut the waves regularly and shipped no more water. It was no longer a metal mountain making against a mountain of water, but as sedentary as a rock. The Great Eastern received the billows with perfect indifference. The rain fell in torrents, and we were obliged to take refuge under the eaves of the Grand Saloon. With the shower the violence of the wind and sea assuaged, the western sky grew clear, and the last black clouds vanished in the opposite horizon. At 10 o'clock the hurricane sent us a farewell gust. At noon an observation was able to be made, and was as follows. Lat. 49 degrees 50 N. Long. 61 degrees 57 W. Course 193 miles. This considerable diminution in the ship's speed could only be attributed to the tempest, which during the night and morning had incessantly beaten against the ship, and a tempest so terrible that one of the passengers, almost an inhabitant of the Atlantic, which he had crossed 44 times, declared he had never seen the like. The engineer even said that during the storm, when the Great Eastern was 3 days in the trough of the sea, the ship had never been attacked with such violence, and it must be repeated that even if this admirable steamship did go at an inferior speed, and rolled decidedly too much, she nevertheless presented a sure security against the fury of the sea, which she resisted like a block, owing to the perfect homogeneity of her construction. But let me also say, however powerful she might be, it was not right to expose her, without any reason whatever, to a baffling sea. For however strong, however imposing a ship may appear, it is not disgraced because it flies before the tempest. A commander ought always to remember that a man's life is worth more than the mere satisfaction of his own pride. In any case, to be obstinate is blamable, and to be willful is dangerous. A recent incident in which a dreadful catastrophe happened to a 128 transatlantic steamer shows us that a captain ought not to struggle blindly against the sea, even when he sees the boat of a rival company creeping ahead. Chapter 26. In the meantime the pumps were exhausting the lake which had been formed in the hold of the Great Eastern, like a lagoon in the middle of an island. Powerfully and rapidly worked by steam, they speedily restored to the Atlantic that which belonged to it. The rain had ceased and the wind freshened again, but the sky, swept by the tempest, was clear. I stayed several hours after dark walking on deck. Great floods of light poured from the half-opened hatchways of the saloons, and at the stern stretched a phosphorescent light as far as the eye could reach, streaked here and there by the luminous crests of the waves. The stars reflected in the lactescent water appeared and disappeared, as though peering through rapidly driving clouds. Night had spread her sombre covering far and near. Forward roared the thunder of the wheels, whilst beneath me I heard the clanking of the rudder chains. Going back to the saloon door, I was surprised to see 130 there, a compact crowd of spectators, and to hear vociferous applauses, for in spite of the day's disasters, the entertainment was taking place as usual. Not a thought of the wounded and perhaps dying sailor. The assembly seemed highly animated, and loud hurrahs hailed the appearance of a troop of minstrels on board the Great Eastern. The niggers, black or blackened according to their origin, were no others than sailors in disguise. They were dressed in cast-off trumpery, ornamented with sea biscuits for buttons. The opera glasses which they sported were composed of 2 bottles fastened together, and their Jew's harps consisted of catgut stretched on cork. These merry andrews were amusing enough upon the whole. They sang comic songs, and improvised a mixture of puns and cock and bull stories. The uproarious cheers with which their performances were greeted only made them increase their contortions and grimaces, until one of them, as nimble as a monkey, finished the performance by dancing the sailor's hornpipe. A troop of minstrels. However amusing the minstrels may have been, they had not succeeded in attracting all the passengers. Numbers of them had flocked to their usual haunt, the smoking room, and were eagerly pressing round the gaming tables, where enormous stakes were being made, some defending their acquisitions during the voyage, others trying to conquer fate by making rash wagers at the last moment. The roue was in a violent uproar. One could hear the voice of the money agent crying the stakes, the oaths of the losers, the clinking of gold, and the rustling of dollar papers. Then there was a sudden lull. The uproar was silenced by a bold stake, but as soon as the result was known, the noise was redoubled. I very seldom entered the smoking room, for I have a horror of gambling. It is always a vulgar and often an unhealthy pastime, and it is a vice which does not go alone. The man who gambles will find himself capable of any evil. Here reigned Harry Drake in the midst of his parasites. Here also flourished those adventurers who were going to seek their fortunes in America. I always avoided a meeting with these boisterous men, so this evening I passed the door without going in, when my attention was arrested by a violent outburst of cries and curses. I listened, and after a moment's silence, to my great astonishment, I thought I could distinguish Fabian's voice. What could he be doing in this place? Had he come here to look for his enemy, and thus the catastrophe until now avoided been brought about? I quickly pushed the door open. At this moment the uproar was at its height. In the midst of the crowd of gamblers I saw Fabian standing facing Harry Drake. I hurried towards him. Harry Drake had undoubtedly grossly insulted him, for Fabian was aiming a blow with his fist at 130 to him, and if it did not reach the place it was intended for, it was only because Corsican suddenly appeared and stopped him with a quick gesture. But addressing himself to his enemy, Fabian said in a cold, sarcastic tone, "Do you accept that blow?" "Yes," replied Drake, "and here is my card." Thus, in spite of our efforts, an inevitable fatality had brought these 2 deadly enemies together. It was too late to separate them now. Events must take their course. Captain Corsican looked at me, and I was surprised to see sadness rather than annoyance in his eyes. "Do you accept that blow?" In the meantime, Fabian picked up the card which Harry Drake had thrown on the table. He held it between the tips of his fingers as if loath to touch it. Corsican was pale, and my heart beat wildly. At last Fabian looked at the card and read the name on it, then with a voice stifled by passion he cried, "Harry Drake, you. "The same, Captain Mac Elwyn," quietly replied Fabian's rival. We were not deceived. If Fabian was ignorant until now of Drake's name, the latter was only too well aware of Fabian's presence on the Great Eastern. Chapter 27. The next day at break of dawn, I went in search of Captain Corsican, whom I found in the Grand Saloon. He had passed the night with Fabian, who was still suffering from the shock which the name of Ellen's husband had given him. Did a secret intuition tell him that Drake was not alone on board? Had Ellen's presence been revealed to him by the appearance of this man? Lastly, could he guess that the poor crazed woman was the young girl whom he so fondly loved? Corsican could not say, for Fabian had not uttered one word all night. Corsican resented Fabian's wrongs with a kind of brotherly feeling. The intrepid nature of the latter had from childhood irresistibly attracted him, and he was now in the greatest despair. "I came in too late," said he to me. "Before Fabian could have raised his hand, I ought to have struck that wretch." "Useless violence," replied I. "Harry Drake would not 134 have risked a quarrel with you. He has a grudge against Fabian, and a meeting between the two had become inevitable." "You are right," said the captain. "That rascal has got what he wanted. He knew Fabian, his past life and his love. Perhaps Ellen, deprived of reason, betrayed her secret thoughts, or rather, did not Drake before his marriage learn from the loyal young woman all he was ignorant of regarding her past life? Urged by a base impulse, and finding himself in contact with Fabian, he has waited for an opportunity in which he could assume the part of the offended. This scoundrel ought to be a clever duelist." "Yes," replied I, "he has already had 3 or 4 encounters of the kind." "My dear sir," said the captain, "it is not the duel in itself which I fear for Fabian. Captain Mac Elwyn is one of those who never trouble themselves about danger, but it is the result of this engagement which is to be dreaded. If Fabian were to kill this man, however vile he may be, it would place an impossible barrier between Ellen and himself, and heaven knows, the unhappy woman needs a support like Fabian in the state she now is." "True," said I. "Whatever happens, we can but hope that Harry Drake will fall. Justice is on our side." "Certainly," replied the captain, "but one cannot help 135 feeling distressed to think that even at the risk of my own life, I could not have spared Fabian this." "Captain," said I, taking the hand of this devoted friend, "Drake has not sent his seconds yet, so that, although circumstances are against us, I do not despair." "Do you know any means of preventing the duel?" "None at present. At the same time, if the meeting must take place, it seems to me that it can only do so in America, and before we get there, chance, which has brought about this state of things, will, perhaps, turn the scales in our favor." Captain Corsican shook his head like a man who had no faith in the efficacy of chance in human affairs. At this moment, Fabian went up the stairs leading to the deck. I only saw him for a moment, but I was struck by the deadly pallor of his face. The wound had been reopened, and it was sad to see him wandering aimlessly about, trying to avoid us. Even friendship may be troublesome at times, and Corsican and I thought it better to respect his grief rather than interfere with him. But suddenly Fabian turned, and coming towards us said, "The mad woman, was she? It was Ellen, was it not? Poor Ellen." He was still doubtful, and went away without waiting for an answer, which we had not the courage to give. Chapter 28. At noon, Drake had not sent Fabian his seconds to my knowledge, and these were preliminaries which could not be dispensed with. If Drake determined to demand immediate satisfaction, might we not take hope from this delay? I knew that the Saxon race do not regard a debt of honor as we do, and that duels had almost disappeared from English customs. For, as I have already said, not only is there a severe law against duelists, but moreover the public opinion is strongly averse to them. At the same time, in this, which was an uncommon case, the engagement had evidently been voluntarily sought for. The offended had, so to speak, provoked the offender, and my reasonings always tended to the same conclusion, that a meeting between Fabian and Harry Drake was inevitable. The deck was at this moment crowded with passengers and crew returning from service. 137, at 12:30, the observation resulted in the following note. Lat. 40 degrees 33 N. Long. 66 degrees 24 W. Course 214 miles. Thus the Great Eastern was only 348 miles from Sandy Hook Point, a narrow tongue of land which forms the entrance to the New York harbor. It would not be long before we were in American seas. I did not see Fabian in his usual place at lunch, but Drake was there, and although talkative, he did not appear to be quite at his ease. Was he trying to drown his fears in wine? I cannot say, but he indulged in bountiful libations with his friends. Several times I saw him leering at me, but insolent as he was, he dared not look me in the face. Was he looking for Fabian among the crowd of guests? I noticed he left the table abruptly before the meal was finished, and I got up immediately in order to observe him, but he went to his cabin and shut himself up there. I went up on deck. Not a wave disturbed the calm surface of the sea, and the sky was unsullied by a cloud. The two mirrors mutually reflected their azure hue. I met Dr. Pitford, who gave me bad news of the wounded sailor. The invalid was getting worse, and in spite of the 138 doctors' assurance, it was difficult to think that he could recover. At 4 o'clock, a few minutes before dinner, a ship was hailed to larboard. The first officer told me he thought it must be the City of Paris, one of the finest steamers of the Inman Company, but he was mistaken, for the steamer coming nearer sent us her name, which was the Saxonia, belonging to the National Steamship Company. For a few minutes the two boats came alongside, within 2 or 3 cables' length of each other. The deck of the Saxonia was covered with passengers, who saluted us with loud cheers. At 5 o'clock another ship on the horizon, but too far off for her nationality to be recognized. This time it was undoubtedly the City of Paris. This meeting with ships, and the salutation between the Atlantic's visitors, caused great excitement on board. One can understand that as there is little difference between one ship and another, the common danger of facing the uncertain element unites even strangers by a friendly bond. At 6 o'clock a third ship appeared, the Philadelphia, one of the Inman line, used for the transportation of emigrants from Liverpool to New York. We were evidently in frequented seas, and land could not be far off. How I longed to reach it. The Europe, a steamer belonging to the Transatlant Company, carrying passengers from Havre to New York, was expected, but she did not come in sight, and had most likely taken a more northerly course. Night closed in about 7:30. As the sun sank below the horizon, the moon grew brighter, and for some time hung shining in the heavens. A prayer meeting, held by Captain Anderson, interspersed with hymns, lasted until 9 o'clock. The day passed without either Captain Corsican or myself receiving a visit from Drake's seconds. Chapter 29. The next day, Monday, the 8th of April, the weather was very fine. I found the doctor on deck basking in the sun. He came up to me. "Ah well," said he, "our poor sufferer died in the night. The doctor never gave him up. Oh, those doctors, they never will give in. This is the 4th man we have lost since we left Liverpool, the 4th gone towards paying the Great Eastern's debt, and we are not at the end of our voyage yet." "Poor fellow," said I, "just as we are nearing port, and the American coast almost in sight, what will become of his widow and little children?" "Would you have it otherwise, my dear sir? It is the law, the great law. We must die. We must give way to others. It is my opinion we die simply because we are occupying a place which by rights belongs to another. Now can you tell me how many people will have died during my existence if I live to be 60? 141. I have no idea, doctor." "The calculation is simple enough," resumed Dean Pitford. "If I live 60 years, I shall have been in the war 900 days, or 525,600 hours, or 31,536,000 minutes, or lastly, 1,892,160,000 seconds, in round numbers 2 billion seconds. Now in that time 2,000 millions individuals who were in the way of their successors will have died, and when I have become inconvenient, I shall be put out of the way in the same manner, so that the long and short of the matter is to put off becoming inconvenient as long as possible." The doctor continued for some time arguing on this subject, tending to prove to me a very simple theory, the mortality of human creatures. I did not think it worthwhile to discuss the point with him, so I let him have his say. Whilst we paced backwards and forwards, the doctor talking, and I listening, I noticed that the carpenters on board were busy repairing the battered stem. If Captain Anderson did not wish to arrive in New York with damages, the carpenters would have to hurry over their work, for the Great Eastern was rapidly speeding through the tranquil waters. This I understood from the lively demeanor of the young lovers, who no longer thought of counting the turns of the wheels. The long pistons expanded, and the enormous cylinders heaving on their axle swings looked like a great peal of bells clanging 142 together at random. The wheels made 11 revolutions a minute, and the steamship went at the rate of 13 miles an hour. At noon the officers dispensed with making an observation. They knew their situation by calculation, and land must be signalled before long. While I was walking on deck after lunch, Captain Corsican came up. I saw from the thoughtful expression on his face that he had something to tell me. "Fabian," said he, "has received Drake's seconds. I am to be his second, and he begs me to ask you if you would kindly be present on the occasion. He may rely on you." "Yes, Captain, so all hope of deferring or preventing this meeting has vanished." "All hope. But tell me, how did the quarrel arise?" "A discussion about the play was a pretext for it, nothing else. The fact is, if Fabian was not aware who Harry Drake was, it is quite evident he knew Fabian, and the name of Fabian is so odious to him that he would gladly slay the man to whom it belongs. Who are Drake's seconds? I asked. One of them is that actor, Dr. T. Just so, the other is a Yankee I do not know. 143. When are you to expect them? I am waiting for them here. And just as he spoke I saw the seconds coming towards us. Dr. T. cleared his throat. He undoubtedly thought a great deal more of himself as the representative of a rogue. His companion, another of Drake's associates, was one of those extraordinary merchants who has always for sale anything you may ask him to buy. Dr. T. spoke first, after making a very emphatic bow, which Captain Corsican hardly condescended to acknowledge. Gentlemen, said Dr. T., in a grave tone, our friend Drake, a gentleman whose merit and deportment cannot fail to be appreciated by everyone, has sent us to arrange a somewhat delicate affair with you. That is to say, Captain Fabian Mac Elwyn, to whom we first addressed ourselves, referred us to you as his representative. I hope that we shall be able to come to an understanding between ourselves worthy the position of gentlemen touching the delicate object of our mission. We made no reply, but allowed the gentleman to become embarrassed with his delicacy. Gentlemen, continued he, there is not the remotest doubt but that Captain Mac Elwyn is in the wrong. That gentleman has unreasonably, and without the slightest pretext, questioned the honour of Harry Drake's 144 proceedings in a matter of play, and without any provocation offered him the greatest insult a gentleman could receive. These honeyed words made the captain impatient. He bit his moustache and could refrain speaking no longer. Come to the point, said he sharply to Dr. T., whose speech he had interrupted. We don't want so many words, the affair is simple enough. Captain Mac Elwyn raised his hand against Mr. Drake. Your friend accepted the blow. He assumes the part of the offended and demands satisfaction. He has the choice of arms. What next? Does Captain Mac Elwyn accept the challenge? Asked the doctor, baffled by Corsican's tone. Decidedly. Our friend Harry Drake has chosen swords. Very well, and where is the engagement to take place? In New York? No, here on board. On board be it so. At what time? Tomorrow morning. This evening at 6 o'clock at the end of the upper deck, which will be deserted at that time. Very well. Thus saying, the captain took my arm and turned his back on Dr. T. Chapter 30. It was no longer possible to put off the duel. Only a few hours separated us from the moment when Fabian and Harry Drake must meet. What could be the reason of this haste? How was it that Harry Drake had not delayed the duel until he and his enemy had disembarked? Was it because this ship, freighted by a French company, seemed to him the most favourable ground for a meeting which must be a deadly struggle? Or rather, might not Drake have a secret interest in freeing himself of Fabian before the latter could set foot on the American continent, or suspect the presence of Ellen on board, which he must have thought was unknown to all save himself? Yes, it must have been for this reason. Little matter after all, said the captain, far better to have it over. Shall I ask Dr. Pitford to be present at the duel as a doctor? 146. Yes, it would be well to do so. Corsican left me to go to Fabian. At this moment the bell on deck began tolling, and when I inquired of a steersman the reason of this unusual occurrence, he told me that it was for the burial of the sailor who had died in the night, and that the sad ceremony was about to take place. The sky, until now so clear, became overcast, and dark clouds loomed threateningly in the south. At the sound of the bell the passengers flocked to the starboard side. The bridges, paddle boards, bulwarks, masts, and shore boats, hanging from their davits, were crowded with spectators. The officers, sailors, and stokers off duty stood in ranks on deck. At 2 o'clock a group of sailors appeared at the far end of the upper deck. They had left the hospital and were passing the rudder engine. The corpse, sewn in a piece of sail and stretched on a board with a cannon ball at the feet, was carried by 4 men. The body, covered with the British flag and followed by the dead man's comrades, slowly advanced into the midst of the spectators, who uncovered their heads as the procession passed. On their arrival at the starboard paddle wheel, the corpse was deposited on a landing of a staircase which terminated at the main deck. In front of the row of spectators, standing one above the other, were Captain Anderson and his principal officers 147 in full uniform. The captain, holding a prayer book in his hand, took his hat off, and for some minutes during a profound silence which not even the breeze interrupted, he solemnly read the prayer for the dead, every word of which was distinctly audible in the death-like silence. The prayer for the dead. On a sign from the captain, the body, released by the bearers, sank into the sea. For one moment it floated on the surface, became upright, and then disappeared in a circle of foam. At this moment the voice of the sailor on watch was heard crying, "Land!" Chapter 31. The land announced at the moment when the sea was closing over the corpse of the poor sailor was low-lying, and of a yellow colour. This line of slightly elevated downs was Long Island, a great sandy bank enlivened with vegetation, which stretches along the American coast from Montauk Point to Brooklyn, adjoining New York. Several yachts were coasting along this island, which is covered with villas and pleasure houses, the favourite resorts of the New Yorkists. Every passenger waved his hand to the land so longed for after the tedious voyage, which had not been exempt from painful accidents. Every telescope was directed towards this first specimen of the American continent, and each saw it under a different aspect. The Yankee beheld in it his motherland. The Southerner regarded these northern lands with a kind of scorn, the scorn of the conquered for the conqueror. The Canadian looked upon it as a man who 149 had only one step to take to call himself a citizen of the Union. The Californian in his mind's eye traversed the plains of the far west, and, crossing the Rocky Mountains, had already set foot on their inexhaustible mines. The Mormonite, with elevated brow and scornful lip, hardly noticed these shores, but peered beyond to where stood the city of the saints on the borders of Salt Lake, in the far-off deserts. As for the young lovers, this continent was to them the promised land. In the meanwhile the sky was growing more and more threatening. A dark line of clouds gathered in the zenith, and a suffocating heat penetrated the atmosphere as though a July sun was shining directly above us. "Would you like me to astonish you?" said the doctor who had joined me on the gangway. "Astonish me, doctor." "Well then, we shall have a storm, perhaps a thunderstorm, before the day is over." "A thunderstorm in the month of April," I cried. "The Great Eastern does not trouble herself about seasons," replied Dean Pitford, shrugging his shoulders. "It is a tempest called forth expressly on her account. Look at the threatening aspect of those clouds which cover the sky. They look like antediluvian animals, and before long they will devour each other." "I confess," said I, "the sky looks stormy, and were it 153 months later I should be of your opinion, but not at this time of year." "I tell you," replied the doctor, growing animated, "the storm will burst out before many hours are past. I feel it like a barometer. Look at those vapours rising in a mass, observe that cirrus, those mares' tails which are blending together, and those thick circles which surround the horizon. Soon there will be a rapid condensing of vapour, which will consequently produce electricity. Besides, the mercury has suddenly fallen, and the prevailing wind is southwest, the only one which can brew a storm in winter." "Your observations may be very true, doctor," said I, not willing to yield, "but who has ever witnessed a thunderstorm at this season, and in this latitude?" "We have proof, sir, we have proof on record. Mild winters are often marked by storms. You ought only to have lived in 1772, or even in 1824, and you would have heard the roaring of the thunder, in the first instance in February, and in the second in December. In the month of January, 1837, a thunderbolt fell near Drammen in Norway, and did considerable mischief. Last year, in the month of February, fishing smacks from Treport were struck by lightning. If I had time to consult statistics, I would soon put you to silence." "Well, doctor, since you will have it so, we shall soon see. At any rate, you are not afraid of thunder." 151, "Not I," replied the doctor. "The thunder is my friend, better still, it is my doctor." "Your doctor?" "Most certainly. I was struck by lightning in my bed on the 13th July, 1867, at Kew near London, and it cured me of paralysis in my right arm, when the doctors had given up the case as hopeless." "You must be joking." "Not at all. It is an economical treatment by electricity. My dear sir, there are many very authentic facts which prove that thunder surpasses the most skillful physicians, and its intervention is truly marvellous in apparently hopeless cases." "Nevertheless," said I have little trust in your doctor and would not willingly consult him." "Because you have never seen him at work. Stay, here is an instance which I have heard of as occurring in 1817. A peasant in Connecticut who was suffering from asthma supposed to be incurable was struck by lightning in a field and radically cured. In fact, I believe the doctor would have been capable of making the thunder into pills. "Laugh ignoramus," said he to me, "you know nothing either of the weather or medicine." Chapter 32. Dean Pitford left me, but I remained on deck watching the storm rise. Corsican was still closeted with Fabian, who was undoubtedly making some arrangements in case of misfortune. I then remembered that he had a sister in New York, and I shuddered at the thought that perhaps we should have to carry to her the news of her brother's death. I should like to have seen Fabian, but I thought it better not to disturb either him or Captain Corsican. I remained on deck watching the storm rise. At 4 o'clock we came in sight of land stretching before Long Island. It was Fire Island. In the center rose a lighthouse which shone over the surrounding land. The passengers again invaded the upper decks and bridges. All eyes were strained towards the coast, distant about 6 miles. They were waiting for the moment when the arrival of the pilot should settle the great pool business. It may be thought that those who had night quarters, and I was of the number, had given up all pretensions, and that those with the day quarters, except those included between 4 and 6 o'clock, had no longer any chance. Before night, the pilot would come on board and settle this affair, so that all the interest was now concentrated in the 7 or 8 persons to whom fate had attributed the next quarters. The latter were taking advantage of their good luck, selling, buying, and reselling their chances, bartering with such energy one might almost have fancied oneself in the Royal Exchange. At 16 minutes past 4 a small schooner, bearing towards the steamship, was signalled to starboard. There was no longer any possible doubt of its being the pilot's boat, and he would be on board in 14 or 15 minutes at the most. The struggle was now between the possessors of the second and third quarters from 4 to 5 o'clock. Demands and offers were made with renewed vivacity. Then absurd wagers were laid even on the pilot's person, the tenor of which I have faithfully given. $10 that the pilot is married. 20 that he is a widower. $30 that he has a mustache. 60 that he has a wart on his nose. $100 that he will step on board with his right foot first. 154 he will smoke. He will have a pipe in his mouth. No, a cigar. No, yes, no. And 20 other wagers quite as ridiculous, which found those more absurd still to accept them. A small schooner was signalled to starboard. In the meanwhile the little schooner was sensibly approaching the steamship, and we could distinguish her graceful proportions. These charming little pilot boats of about 50 or 60 tons are good sea boats, skimming over the water like seagulls. The schooner, gracefully inclined, was bearing windward in spite of the breeze, which had begun to freshen. Her mast and foresails stood out clearly against the dark background of clouds, and the sea foamed beneath her bows. When at 2 cables' length from the Great Eastern, she suddenly veered and launched a shore boat. Captain Anderson gave orders to heave to, and for the first time during a fortnight the wheels of the screw were motionless. A man got into the boat, which 4 sailors quickly pulled to the steamship. A rope ladder was thrown over the side of the giant down to the pilot in his little nutshell, which the latter caught, and, skillfully climbing, sprang on deck. He was received with joyous cries by the winners, and exclamations of disappointment from the losers. The pool was regulated by the following statements. 155, the pilot was married. He had no wart on his nose. He had a light mustache. He had jumped on board with both feet. Lastly, it was 36 minutes past 4 o'clock when he set foot on the deck of the Great Eastern. The possessor of the 33rd quarter thus gained the $96, and it was Captain Corsican, who had hardly thought of the unexpected gain. It was not long before he appeared on deck, and when the pool was presented to him, he begged Captain Anderson to keep it for the widow of the young sailor whose death had been caused by the inroad of the sea. The captain shook his hand without saying a word, but a moment afterwards a sailor came up to Corsican, and bowing awkwardly, "Sir," said he, "my mates have sent me to say that you are a very kind gentleman, and they all thank you in the name of poor Wilson, who cannot thank you for himself." The captain, moved by the rough sailor's speech, silently pressed his hand. As for the pilot, he was a man of short stature, with not much of the sailor look about him. He wore a glazed hat, black trousers, a brown overcoat lined with red, and carried an umbrella. He was master on board now. In springing on deck, before he went to the bridge, he 156 had thrown a bundle of papers among the passengers, who eagerly pounced on them. They were European and American journals, the political and civil bonds which again united the Great Eastern to the two continents. Chapter 33. The storm was gathering, and a black arch of clouds had formed over our heads. The atmosphere was misty. Nature was evidently about to justify Dr. Pitford's presentiments. The steamship had slackened her speed, and the wheels only made 3 or 4 revolutions a minute. Volumes of white steam escaped from the half-open valves, the anchor chains were cleared, and the British flag floated from the mainmast. These arrangements Captain Anderson had made preparatory to mooring. The pilot, standing on the top of the starboard paddle, guided the steamship through the narrow passages, but the tide was already turning, so that the Great Eastern could not yet cross the bar of the Hudson, and we must wait till next day. At 4:45 by the pilot's order the anchors were let go. The chains rattled through the hawse holes with a noise like thunder. I even thought for a moment that the storm had burst forth. When the anchors were firmly embedded in the sand, the Great Eastern, swung round by the ebb tide, remained motionless, and not a wave disturbed the surface of the water. At this moment the steward's trumpet sounded for the last time. It called the passengers to their farewell dinner. The society of freighters would be prodigal with the champagne, and no one wished to be absent. An hour later the saloons were crowded with guests, and the deck deserted. However, 7 persons left their places unoccupied. The 2 adversaries who were going to stake their lives in a duel, the 4 seconds, and the doctor, who was to be present at the engagement. The time and the place for the meeting had been well chosen. There was not a creature on deck. The passengers were in the dining rooms, the sailors in their berths, the officers absorbed with their own particular bottles, and not a steersman on board, for the ship was motionless at anchor. At 5:10 the doctor and I were joined by Fabian and Captain Corsican. I had not seen Fabian since the scene in the smoking room. He seemed to me sad but very calm. The thought of the duel troubled him little apparently. His mind was elsewhere, and his eyes wandered restlessly in search of Ellen. He held out his hand to me without saying a word. "Has not Harry Drake arrived?" asked the captain of me. 159, "Not yet," I replied. "Let us go to the stern, that is the place of rendezvous." Fabian, Captain Corsican and I walked along the upper decks. The sky was growing dark. We heard the distant roar of thunder rumbling along the horizon. It was like a monotonous bass, enlivened by the hips and hurrahs issuing from the saloons. Flashes of lightning darted through the black clouds, and the atmosphere was powerfully charged with electricity. At 5:20 Harry Drake and his seconds made their appearance. The gentleman bowed to us, which honour we strictly returned. Drake did not utter a word, but his face showed signs of ill-concealed excitement. He cast a look of malignant hatred on Fabian, but the latter, leaning against the hatchway, did not even see him. So absorbed was he in a profound meditation, he seemed not yet to have thought of the part he was to play in this drama. In the meanwhile Captain Corsican, addressing himself to the Yankee, one of Drake's seconds, asked him for the swords, which the latter presented to him. They were battle swords, the basket hilts of which entirely protected the hand which held them. Corsican took them, bent and measured them, and then allowed the Yankee to choose. Whilst these preparations were being made, Harry Drake had taken off his hat and jacket, unbuttoned his shirt, and turned up his sleeves. Then he seized his sword, and I saw that he was left-handed, which gave him, accustomed to right-handed antagonists, an unquestionable advantage. Fabian had not yet left the place where he was standing. One would have thought that these preparations had nothing to do with him. Captain Corsican went up to him, touched him, and showed him the sword. Fabian looked at the glittering steel, and it seemed as if his memory came back to him at that moment. He grasped his sword with a firm hand. "Right," he murmured, "I remember." Then he placed himself opposite Harry Drake, who immediately assumed the defensive. "Proceed, gentlemen," said the captain. They immediately crossed swords. From the first clashing of steel, several rapid passes on both sides, certain extrications, parries and thrusts proved to me the equality in strength of the opponents. I augured well for Fabian. He was cool, self-possessed and almost indifferent to the struggle, certainly less affected by it than were his own seconds. Harry Drake, on the contrary, scowled at him with flashing eyes and clenched teeth, his head bent forward, and his whole countenance indicative of a hatred which deprived him of all composure. He had come there to kill, and kill he would. After the first engagement, which lasted some minutes, swords were lowered. With the exception of a slight scratch on Fabian's arm, neither of the combatants had been wounded. They rested, and Drake wiped off the perspiration with which his face was bathed. The storm now burst forth in all its fury. The thunder was continuous and broke out in loud, deafening reports. The atmosphere was charged with electricity to such an extent that the swords were gilded with luminous crests, like lightning conductors in the midst of thunder clouds. After a few moments' rest, Corsican again gave the signal to proceed, and Fabian and Harry Drake again fell to work. This time the fight was much more animated, Fabian defending himself with astounding calmness, Drake madly attacking him. Several times I expected a stroke from Fabian, which was not even attempted. Suddenly, after some quick passes, Drake made a rapid stroke. I thought that Fabian must have been struck in the chest, but warding off the blow, he struck Harry Drake's sword smartly. The latter raised and covered himself by a swift semicircle, whilst the lightning rent the clouds overhead. Suddenly, and without anything to explain this strange surrender of himself, Fabian dropped his sword. Had he been mortally wounded without our noticing it? The 162 blood rushed wildly to my heart. Fabian's eyes had grown singularly animated. "Defend yourself," roared Drake, drawing himself up like a tiger ready to spring on to his prey. I thought that it was all over with Fabian, disarmed as he was. Corsican threw himself between him and his enemy to prevent the latter from striking a defenseless man, but now Harry Drake in his turn stood motionless. I turned and saw Ellen, pale as death, her hands stretched out, coming towards the duelists. Fabian, fascinated by this apparition, remained perfectly still. You, cried Harry Drake to Ellen, "you here." I turned and saw Ellen, pale as death. His uplifted blade gleamed as though on fire. One might have said it was the sword of the Archangel Michael in the hands of a demon. Suddenly a brilliant flash of lightning lit up the whole stern. I was almost knocked down and felt suffocated, for the air was filled with sulphur, but by a powerful effort I regained my senses. I had fallen on one knee, but I got up and looked around. Ellen was leaning on Fabian. Harry Drake seemed petrified and remained in the same position, but his face had grown black. Had the unhappy man been struck when attracting the lightning with his blade? Ellen left Fabian and went up to Drake with her face 163 full of holy compassion. She placed her hand on his shoulder. Even this light touch was enough to disturb the equilibrium, and Drake fell to the ground a corpse. Ellen bent over the body whilst we drew back terrified. The wretched Harry Drake was dead. "Struck by lightning," said Dean Pitford, catching hold of my arm. "Struck by lightning. Ah, will you not now believe in the intervention of thunder?" Had Harry Drake indeed been struck by lightning as Dean Pitford affirmed, or rather, as the doctor on board said, had a blood vessel broken in his chest? I can only say there was nothing now but a corpse before our eyes. Chapter 34. The next day, Tuesday, the 9th of April, the Great Eastern weighed anchor and set sail to enter the Hudson, the pilot guiding her with an unerring eye. The storm had spent itself in the night, and the last black clouds disappeared below the horizon. The aspect of the sea was enlivened by a flotilla of schooners, waiting along the coast for the breeze. A small steamer came alongside, and we were boarded by the officer of the New York Sanitary Commissioners. It was not long before we passed the light boat which marks the channels of the Hudson, and ranged near Sandy Hook Point, where a group of spectators greeted us with a volley of hurrahs. When the Great Eastern had gone round the interior bay formed by Sandy Hook Point, through the flotilla of fishing smacks, I caught a glimpse of the verdant heights of New Jersey, the enormous forts on the bay, then the 165 low line of the great city stretching between the Hudson and East River. In another hour, after having ranged opposite the New York Keys, the Great Eastern was moored in the Hudson, and the anchors became entangled in the submarine cable, which must necessarily be broken on her departure. Then began the disembarkation of all my fellow voyagers whom I should never see again, Californians, Southerners, Mormonites, and the young lovers. I was waiting for Fabian and Corsican. I had been obliged to inform Captain Anderson of the incidents relating to the duel which had taken place on board. The doctors made their report, and nothing whatever having been found wrong in the death of Harry Drake, orders were given that the last duties might be rendered to him on land. At this moment Cockburn, the statistician, who had not spoken to me the whole of the voyage, came up and said, "Do you know, sir, how many turns the wheels have made during our passage?" "I do not, sir." 100,723. Ah, really, sir, and the screw? 608,130. 166. I am much obliged to you, sir, for the information. And the statistician left me without any farewell whatever. Fabian and Corsican joined me at this moment. Fabian pressed my hand warmly. Ellen, said he to me, Ellen will recover. Her reason came back to her for a moment. Ah, God is just, and he will restore her wholly to us. Whilst thus speaking, Fabian smiled as he thought of the future. As for Captain Corsican, he kissed me heartily without any ceremony. Goodbye, goodbye, we shall see you again, he cried to me, when he had taken his place in the tender where were Fabian and Ellen, under the care of Mrs. R., Captain Mac Elwin's sister, who had come to meet her brother. Then the tender sheered off, taking the first convoy of passengers to the Custom House pier. I watched them as they went farther and farther away, and seeing Ellen sitting between Fabian and his sister, I could not doubt that care, devotion and love would restore to this poor mind the reason of which grief had robbed it. Just then someone took hold of my arm, and I knew it was Dr. Pitford. Well, said he, and what is going to become of you? My idea was, Doctor, since the Great Eastern remains 192 hours at New York, on as I must return with her, to spend the 192 hours in America. Certainly it is but a week well spent is perhaps long enough to see New York, the Hudson, the Mohawk Valley, Lake Erie, Niagara, and all the country made familiar by Cooper. Ah, you are going to the Niagara, cried Dean Pitford. I'll declare I should not be sorry to see it again, and if my proposal does not seem very disagreeable to you. The worthy doctor amused me with his crotchets. I had taken a fancy to him, and here was a well-instructed guide placed at my service.